it's a wonderful thing to be called into business, to discover how we've been wired, to discover what God has already put in us and the additional things he wants to give to us through a life that's rooted in intimacy with Jesus, can find a profound, a beautiful and fruitful expression in many spheres of the business world. And I would even argue that there's a real desire among the decision makers in a lot of businesses for people who have those kinds of attributes.
You're listening to the Ferment podcast, conversations about worship and transformation. Today's guest is John Kim. John is an investor, entrepreneur, and along with his wife, Kara, pastor the 166, a church plant in the Hell's Kitchen section of Midtown Manhattan. This episode is brought to you by Monk Drums. Monk Drums is a creative desert venture that strives to combine beauty and business as one heartbeat. Monk Drums' main focus is handcrafted wooden drums that allow us to love, assist, and serve all who accompany us on this path. Use the coupon code FERMENTPOD to get 5% off your Monk Drums order. Find them on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Monk Drums. And every Monday, look for hashtag Monk Drum Monday. Speaking from personal experience, Monk Drums are wonderfully crafted and they sound amazing. They blend the best traits of both the djembe and the cajon, and I found them to be incredibly versatile in both the live and studio environment. Check them out at monkdrums.com.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at worshipteam.com. Worshipteam.com comes preloaded with over 12,000 songs, with new songs being added all the time. Hillsong, Bethel, Vineyard, Six Steps, Jesus Culture, just to name a few. Service building with Worship Team is a snap, and all the songs are completely legal and licensed. You can also find them on social media, Facebook at worshipteam.com, Twitter at worshipteam, Instagram at worshipteam_WT. Visit them at worshipteam.com for a free trial today. Complete worship planning with thousands of songs, easy interface, mobile apps, and legal rights for your church. All you need in one place, worshipteam.com.
All right, what up, everybody? My name is Adam Russell. You're listening to the Ferment podcast, and I am here in the middle of Hell's Kitchen, New York City. It is powerfully urban. I am a long way from home. This is not the ironic green hills of Kentucky. I'm with a new friend, John Kim. John, why don't you say hello?
Hello, how is everyone doing?
That is right. Listen, I'm really excited about this conversation because last night we had dinner, and John, I felt like I was sitting in front of a fire hose of kind of like wisdom and revelation from you. I think my team felt that as well. And so I just instantly knew that we had to do a podcast. But I think a lot of people who are listening to this podcast probably don't know who you are, okay? So maybe we could spend a moment and you could tell us, who are you and where did you come from? And maybe give us a quick little synopsis of your family life.
Sure.
Yeah.
My folks are immigrants. They were both born and raised in South Korea. They came here, about a couple of years before I was born. So they came in the early 70s. We're sitting here in New York City, and basically, the vast majority of my life happened, within 20 miles of where we are right now. I was born in the Bronx, spent a little bit of time out in Queens, but then largely was raised out in Long Island.
So you feel like a New Yorker?
Yeah, I'm one of the few, literally born and raised in New York. I left for my schooling, and then I've been back in New York City for 20 years.
Okay, where'd you go to school?
I did my undergraduate at Harvard and my Ph.D. at MIT.
Okay, so you're no dummy. Yeah. Wow, that's amazing.
But to be honest, I grew up, my first love is soccer.
Okay.
I grew up wanting to be a professional athlete, but I had to surrender that fantasy when I was about 15 because that's when I realized I was a good athlete, but I probably wasn't a genetic freak, which is sort of like what you need to be.
So that's your first heartbreak in life?
Definitely my first heartbreak. The day that when they selected the sort of 50 or so players that are in the national team pool, and I did not make that. That's when I realized I better figure out something else to do.
But you made it to the process where you could
Correct.
possibly be selected.
Correct.
Okay, so you're no slouch.
I was a good player, but I probably peaked a little too early.
Got it.
And I probably will sort of try to live vicariously through my 8-year-old son. And if he suffers the same fate I did, he probably will need therapy. But
You're not even a good father if you don't live at least 10% vicariously through your son, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, hopes and aspirations.
Absolutely.
Where did you play on the field?
I was an outside midfielder, so
Okay.
I could run all day. You know, I was definitely blessed with a lot of speed, and yeah, I could take players on, but I couldn't score goals. That was they tried to make guys with my kind of pace into strikers and goal scorers, and I could never quite deliver on that front.
Oh, that's funny. That's awesome. So you first, as a child, your love was soccer.
Definitely soccer.
Were your mom and dad into that?
No, I don't really even know how it really began. It's not like either one of my parents were particularly into sports, but they took me down to the local club, you know, when I was 6 or 7 years old. And then the local club led to the county select team, which led to the state team, which led to the regional team. And then when I was 14 is when I was trying out for the national team, basically.
Wow, amazing. Now, what did your mom and dad do?
So my mom was trained as a pharmacist, and so she practiced pharmacy. And then my dad, he was sort of an entrepreneur, and so he kind of imported trinkets, handbags, things of that nature, and then resold them to department stores.
Got it. So was the transition to the United States, was that like an adventure and fun for them, or was it difficult, or all of that?
You know, so they, from my recollection is that they were definitely, they were part of a wave of immigrants from Korea, many of which settled in like LA or New York City. The interesting thing about my parents was they were very deliberate about raising me as an American. So
what does that mean?
Yeah, so a lot of Asian and a lot of Korean immigrants, they sort of settle into these sort of ethnic enclaves, and especially in a place like New York City, where there's Koreatown. There are multiple Koreatowns, actually. There's a K-town, they call it K-town in LA, in Queens, in New York City. And so I could have easily been raised in an environment where everyone I knew was Korean. That may have been the language spoken at home, but I spoke English at home. My parents deliberately sent me. I was raised in a town and a school that had literally. I kid. I say almost everyone came over from the Mayflower. There was literally there was no black people, no Hispanics. There was one other Asian couple, and there were maybe a handful of Jewish folk. But they were determined to, and frankly, as far as I knew. Kind of race was always more or less in the background. I felt like I grew up as all my friends, and it was almost, and it's almost strange to say this, but it almost seemed like it was post-racial where I grew up, and that's probably largely because it was pretty, mono-socioeconomic, mono-ethnic.
Yeah. Now, were your parents believers?
They weren't believers, actually, while I was growing up, but they went through some tough times in life. My father's, business struggled pretty mightily towards my junior high school years. And I think that brought my dad to faith.
Was he the first person to come to faith in your family?
Correct. My mom shortly thereafter. And then I had an older sister and a younger sister who also came to faith.
Wow.
And
so it's like a Cornelius experience, the whole house.
Yeah, exactly. So then I actually didn't come to faith until largely my senior year, maybe even after I graduated from college.
Oh, okay.
So my parents,
much later.
Yeah, they were very patient. The rest of my family was patient. I distinctly remember my senior year in college, during Christmas Day, the NBA was on NBC from 11 a.m. until 11 p.m. I sat and watched basketball for 12 hours. My parents and my sisters left for church. Before I started to watch basketball, they came home after, and I had not moved in the couch during that entire day. But they patiently waited, and then I sort of joined them.
What was the emphasis, or what happened in your life for you to become a believer?
I would say that college is a time to experiment.
Okay.
And I experimented with a lot of things that the world
As
offers.
one does.
Yeah, as one does. And to be totally honest, I think that one of the parts of life that I struggled with, especially in my college years, was just constantly dating and engaging. In things I shouldn't have with the opposite sex. And I knew that this wasn't a healthy way to be, but I had no grid for how to stop it. And then a friend of mine introduced me to, this fellow called Jesus. And I just started to attend a Bible study, largely as a critic. But, I just started to open up a little bit to...
Do you remember what your first initial criticism of Jesus was?
I wasn't. I didn't have a formal criticism as much as I was just there as the Christians on campus to me were a nice group.
Yeah.
But they weren't necessarily. It didn't occur to me that these would be folks that I would be. They weren't the natural folks that I would be friends with. But there was one guy in particular who I developed a friendship with. He invited me to come attend a couple Bible studies, and I got into it.
What attracted you?
The lens on Jesus that I had. I distinctly remember this. I was just like, the parts of the Bible that really struck me was kind of the manner in which he dealt with the way he dealt with the crowds, the way he. Obviously, the miracles, those things catch your eye, but there was something about, kind of what the offer, I guess it was the offer that really struck me.
You mean like the invitation of Jesus? Or...
Yeah, and just the idea that, you can only find yourself if you deny yourself. You can only, he says, "Come die that you may truly live."
Yeah.
And even, that I probably have a little bit of a militant streak in me. And so every time the crowds got too large, I felt like Jesus, that's when he would turn around and say, he who is not willing to sacrifice everything that is precious to him, family, friends and all that, you're not worthy to follow me. And I think there was a part of my sort of militant spirit that just sort of was really drawn to that.
Yeah, I think that does really attract certain personalities, especially like young guys in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we want to do something radical, don't we?
Yeah, I actually fully embrace, I love that, that God is kind, that God is gracious. But I think I was probably more drawn initially to, the courage, the sacrifice. I was really drawn to a lot of the Catholic orders. The idea that. Oh no, I'm saying early in my faith journey, I was just sort of like, I watched a handful of movies about Jesuits, and I was always just like,
did you ever watch The Mission?
I did watch The Mission.
Yeah. And by the way, just aside for anybody who's listening right now, like, if you haven't seen the movie The Mission, you must, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Jeremy Irons plays the Jesuit priest, and Robert De Niro is one of the central figures as well. But in any case, as a senior in high school, I basically had my first, I say my first yes to Jesus was sort of a mental assent to a historical reality.
Yeah.
In other words, it's like, oh yeah, the resurrection happened. Jesus is the Son of God. It was almost like an abstraction in some sense.
I think that, but what you're describing to me is, I think, pretty prototypical American Christianity. Like, even as the way the gospel is presented, and I don't know what your experience was, but I can tell you the American South, it's really a reductionist view that is in so many ways just agreement with certain intellectual platitudes.
Yeah. And in some sense, the first step was those platitudes are better than the other sort of the offer of...
Get you on the field.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so it wasn't really until my first year in my PhD program was when I first caught a glimpse of, what I'll call the living God, or the God that intervenes, isn't just sort of the sort of the watchmaker, so to speak, but instead intervenes actually in ordinary life. And it's actually a pretty remarkable story because
Yeah. So what happened then?
I went straight from my undergraduate to my PhD program.
And what was your PhD program?
It's in economics.
Okay. Is that what you studied in the undergrad as well, or did you make a jump?
I did sort of more applied math and economics as an undergraduate.
Got it.
I didn't come to, Harvard as everyone is obviously very gifted intellectually at Harvard, but I came as an athletic recruit for soccer, actually. But, I really found myself as a student, so to speak, as an undergraduate. And so to be admitted into MIT's PhD program, I mean, there's 25 folks in your class. They take one from Harvard, one from Stanford, one from École Polytechnique in Paris. And so you're really among the best of the best.
Did that feel good?
Well, what it did was, in the same way that my first death was the death of my ambitions as an athlete, my second death was the death of my ambitions to be, a professor. So I got to MIT thinking I was pretty tough, and then I realized what real toughness was.
You're not the only one, right?
Oh, not the only one. In a class of 20, 3 of my classmates from my first year at MIT have won the John Bates Clark Medal, which is basically a prelude to winning the Nobel Prize in economics. 3 were in my first year class at MIT, and they were not even the 3 best students.
Get out of here.
In my opinion. And so, but anyway, getting back to how I encountered God. So, I pretty much skated through my undergraduate years. School came pretty easy to me, but then I get to my PhD program, and I am struggling like I have never struggled ever in my life as
with your studies.
Yeah. Like I could barely, understand my notes. I was struggling with doing the problem sets. I was, barely making it through the exams. And so I'll never forget, this is around 6 weeks into my PhD program, and I haven't slept more than an hour for about a week. And I'm sitting there in the student center, MIT Student Center, trying to do yet another problem set, unable to do it. And I just sit down, I put my books away, and I just look up, and I'm like, God, I think you're real. I don't know if you really are.
Yeah.
But you need to do something to my brain now, because if you don't, I don't think I can make it here. And so it was literally almost like a road to Damascus moment. From that day, everything made sense to me.
I love this.
I could understand my notes. I was helping out like my other classmates.
I love
and
this.
I ended up, it all made sense to me. And I actually ended up finishing my PhD after 2.5 years, which is sort of unheard of to finish something that fast. And, I'm not here to suggest that like I said, I'm not better than, my classmates, but it was just sort of this incredible moment where, wow, like God can literally intervene and almost rewire my brain.
So this felt personal to you.
Very.
And were you aware after that prayer? Did you put the timeline together?
It actually took a little while.
Okay.
But like as I look back, it was really probably by the end of my first year is when I realized, hey, like
I prayed a prayer.
And like I get everything now.
Yeah.
Like everything makes sense to me.
So I'm just very curious. Looking back on that, you're clearly not a dummy. You're in over your head. You're feeling it. You pray a prayer that could seem, self-preservation. It could seem like anything, right?
Totally.
Right. And then there's clearly in your mind something happened and you got it, and you became went from someone who needed help to someone who gives help.
Yes.
What do you think that means?
I mean, I've reflected on this. I mean, it was over 20 years ago, but I've reflected on it quite a bit as I've even continued to grow and mature in my faith. But there was something obviously profoundly personal about it. I know in Scripture it says, that God knows each one of us personally, but it's hard to really believe that sometimes.
Yeah.
And the idea that God would intervene in my situation, as a PhD student at MIT in the 90s, like it was a profoundly personal experience. And in a way, it also illustrated to me in a sense that, God is above, at a place like MIT and in some of the institutions that I've been a part of, it's easy to be in awe of the minds and the quality of intellect that's around you.
It's deeply rational.
Yeah. But you realize, God is above all of this.
Amen.
God controls all of this in a way that is, in some sense unfathomable. But it was also profoundly empowering because it's like, you have access to something and potentially even dangerous, maybe even intoxicating in a way. But, when Paul writes that we have the mind of Christ, I read that much later and I was like thinking back, like, gosh, there's something about how, God has all things under his authority and that we as his sons and daughters have access to that. It was very empowering.
Well, John, I'll tell you one thing I hear in that story, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so
Sure.
if you need to redirect, go ahead and do that. But part of what I hear in that story is you're praying and Jesus answers and you're able to, do the work and do it well and get it done quickly. I sort of hear that and go, well, Jesus wanted an economist. I hear vocation in that.
Yeah, I mean,
does that resonate?
It does in an interesting way because I think that a lot of what I spent sort of the next, so I went straight from my PhD program to becoming an investor, and
Here in the city.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had this incredible opportunity right after I finished my PhD program where a fellow by the name of Michael Dell, who I think people may know on this
I think so.
podcast, he's a computer mogul entrepreneur. He started an office just to manage his and his family's assets. And somewhat miraculously, I was given an opportunity to be a part of that team. And in many ways, the question I've always been asking myself, and to this day, I'm still trying to work through it is, what does it mean for my faith and my vocation to be fully integrated, to be one?
Was that something you considered before you took that job?
In a sense, it was probably a little more, rudimentary, I guess, at first, because there's a story I've often told where I was given an offer to join this firm, and I'm 24 years old. I don't know much about anything, but I hear that there's this place called Wall Street, and there's this world where, people, sometimes cut corners, where money is God. And so I'm a relatively new believer, and I receive an offer and I decide to write a letter to these guys about how, hey, I appreciate the offer, but I want you to know that I've just become a pretty committed Christian, and this is what it means.
You wrote this to them.
I wrote this in an email, a very long email, right after I said, thank you for the offer, but let me articulate to you who I am and what I'm about, as 24-year-olds are prone to doing. And in doing so, I gave them sort of my understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, the implications for how I want to do business, how I treat people, the kind of culture I want to be a part of. And it was a relatively long manifesto, which was met with a relatively short one-line response. Sounds good. We look forward to working together.
What did you like? Is that how you got the job?
Basically,
sounds good. We look forward
to working together. Yeah. And so, a couple of weeks later, I come down to New York, start working there, and it was an incredible run. I made partner after 3 years at the firm, which was pretty much unheard of.
Yeah, you're 27.
Basically, yeah. And then at the 5-year anniversary party, the fellow who hired me gets up in front of the firm and says, So I want to tell a story about the early days at MSD Capital. We made an offer to somebody who had never worked a day in his life, and we thought that we were giving him the opportunity of a lifetime. And this young punk had the audacity to come back to us and tell us, these are my terms.
That's right.
And this is the kind of firm I want to be a part of. And so, these are, if you don't agree to these, I'm not coming.
Yeah.
And he gets up and he says, well, and of course, the person who did this is John Kim, who's one of the partners at the firm. And I went to his office the next day and I said to him, hey, Glenn, first of all, just thank you for saying that. I had no idea that you even remembered that exchange that we had 5 years ago. And then he proceeded to pull out an email, a copy of the email in his drawer where he was like, you know what, I still read this from time to time because this is actually the kind of people that I want to have in this organization.
No, but he's not a believer.
He's not a believer. And, obviously at some stage, everyone's on their own journey. But,
of course.
But yeah, it made an impact on him. And as I look back on the 10 years that I spent there, there was a lot of, in some sense, there was a lot of freedom to express, what at least my, as a young man in his 20s, understanding of virtue and of sort of biblical morality in a context like, an investment firm, a very high capacity investment firm.
Well, can we talk about that for a minute? Because I think this is a really important discussion, especially for people who are experiencing their kingdom vocation, maybe outside of church.
Sure.
Okay. And, a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are worship leaders and pastors, but there's also a lot of people who listen to this podcast who are not pastors or worship leaders, but who deeply love Jesus. I guess I would love for you to just talk maybe a minute about how do you see your vocation or your calling as a disciple or a son of God. I mean, we're in New York City. And you're telling me stories about really living at the high end of the finance world. How does that work for you? I mean, because I can imagine scenarios, and it sounds like maybe you had the best bosses that you could possibly have.
Sure.
I can just imagine, like, you write this manifesto. Is that something you had to return to? Like, is this something that Jesus continually talked to you about? Was there consciousness through all those years? Do you still have to kind of like stay grounded? Can you just talk about that?
I mean, I think, again, this is something I'm sort of working out. I mean, I just feel like, it's sort of trite to say, but if the Bible and if what Jesus said is true, it's the foundation of everything. And we're all called to sort of live out and express the reality of these profound truths in whatever sphere we happen to find ourselves, whether it's inside or, outside full-time ministry. I think those lines are somewhat artificial.
Yeah, I agree.
And in many ways, I think, I just said, maybe very early in my investing career, which obviously coincided with, becoming a serious follower of God, I just said to myself, like, what does that look like? What does it look like to be fully engaged in life with God? And like, what should that imply? And so, again, relatively early in my career, I remember the parable of the talents became essentially the foundation. Because I think investing is a constant sort of construct that Jesus uses. He uses a lot of botanical analogies. Which also
seed sown, right?
Seed sowing.
Good soil, bad soil, rocky soil, thorny soil, the whole thing.
Exactly. And like the parable of talents is obviously about, getting a big return.
Yeah.
And in some sense, whether it's told in Matthew or Luke, there's this idea that, a couple of talents are given and the wicked servant buries the treasure, whereas the good and faithful servants, they multiply these things. And the question I often ask myself is, if the good and faithful servants didn't, quote, multiply their talents, would the master have still considered them to be good and faithful? And I think there's a part of me that believes that that he would have, because the important thing is not so much that they got a huge return, but they invested, they were willing to take risk because they had a proper view of the master. And so the wicked servant was the one who said, you know what, I'm afraid to lose it.
I'm afraid of the master.
I'm afraid of the master.
Yeah.
Whereas the ones who were willing to take risk, they were willing to take risk because they felt like they could count on like the kindness and the goodness of God.
And maybe even in a sense, like they could count on the gifts that the master had given them.
Exactly.
The quality gifts.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Applied right. These things do something in the world.
Exactly. And so that's how I viewed my vocation. When you have capital, and capital is obviously, income inequality is this crazy concept that's in the consciousness of society these days. And I think a part of the reason it's present is because if you are an owner of capital, the entire purpose of capital, whether you like it or not, or whether you know it or not, is for it to be sown. It's for it to be invested and for it to bear fruit. And so I often say that, there's a sense sometimes where if you're an owner of capital, where the best thing to do in order to follow out your faith is to, give to the church or to give to other 501c3s. And I've long thought, well, actually, if I invest in a business and that business is run by an entrepreneur who has biblical values, the ability to create jobs, the ability to provide a service that is in and of itself good and noble and fruitful.
Blesses the community and raises up families, right?
Exactly. And as an example of this, there's an entrepreneur that we've backed who's building fitness facilities over in Boston. The first one was actually right outside of Foxborough, where the Patriots play. We don't hold that against them because we have some negative thoughts about Boston sport teams. But laying that aside, but he wanted to build a gym that was largely where instead of people, like the dirty little secret of gyms is the best way to build a profitable gym is to get everyone to sign up right after New Year's, but then they never show up. And he's like, what good is that? So he wanted to build a gym where people actually come and actually are getting healthy. And so, I often tell him, hey, look, his name is Luther. We now have several facilities, over 1,000 people in each one. And I'm like saying, hey, Luther, you know what? I see you as a pastor of multiple congregations of 1,000 people. You have a staff of about 25 to 30 people in each one of these sites. And your job is to demonstrate, what it means to live out our faith in the context of being this entrepreneur.
What a redemptive kingdom view of not only like money and investment, but like what people can do in a community, right?
Absolutely.
That's what I'm hearing in what you're saying.
Absolutely. And, there have been these moments where, we had a fellow, a couple years ago who had to cancel his membership. And these stories don't happen every day, when you have several thousand members. But there's one guy came in, needs to cancel his membership. Luther asked him to come into his office, and he just breaks down crying because he basically was diagnosed with cancer, and that he had to he couldn't be a part of the gym anymore. But then Luther decides, hey, look, let me pray for you. And then he mentioned it to me, and we all started praying for him. And then before you know it, this fellow has a bunch of people praying for him. And then, he's a cancer survivor. Yeah. And so to be able to tell him, hey, look, we're not trying to preach to you here, but we want you to know that, when you came into our office that day, there were a bunch of people, different parts of this country
pastoring.
who were praying for. Exactly.
That's pastoring.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And so, we want those opportunities to be present. And in some sense, obviously the business has to be profitable. It has to be sustainable. But, I'm all about the idea of like noticing, Jesus only did what he saw the Father doing. And so I encourage, Luther to notice like, hey, where do those opportunities reside and where can the kingdom of God break in pretty profound ways? And, so those are, in some sense, that's sort of the whole idea of the business is you get to touch and feel the community and interact with them in a way and then demonstrate the goodness of God.
Yeah. Part of what I'm hearing in everything you've just shared for the last 4 or 5 minutes here is something that Dallas Willard used to talk about. You ever read Dallas Willard?
My favorite of his, Renovation of the Heart. Yeah.
Yeah. Dallas Willard often talked about, in terms of being a student or a disciple of Jesus, he would say something along the lines of, well, I mean, if Jesus is the master and if he's the teacher, he's not just the master and the teacher of like a spiritual life, but he's the master and teacher of all life. And this means that he's the smartest guy, right? And so he knows more about economics than anyone.
Yep.
And he knows more about being a doctor than anyone. He knows more about being an astrophysicist than anyone. And so a real disciple of Jesus knows that we can listen to Jesus about any of the things that he's asking us to do. And I'm really hearing that in your story.
So I think you're touching on what I would call the redemptive edge in some sense. And what I mean by that is, so like, again, when I first came into life with God as an investor, my first thought was, hey, I want the firm that I work in to be, for lack of a better term, morally upright. 6 standard deviations away from, when it comes to sort of propriety with respect to behavior, right? And then the next step was sort of, hey, I actually want the business that we're in to have like a fundamentally redemptive, so obviously, there are a lot of businesses that, are questionable in terms of their, whether or not they align with the heart of God, but others, so you want the substance of the business itself to be, to have a redemptive spirit to it. To me, the ultimate edge in some sense is to have entrepreneurs and business leaders who are really receiving divine wisdom and divine revelation on what to do.
Yeah.
And a part of me, I'm still working some of this stuff out, but a part of me feels like in an era where, in some sense, and I don't want to, this is not the prosperity gospel in any way, shape, or form I'm trying to preach, but in an era where there's a lot of incredibly well-credentialed people trying to do things, what might separate the entrepreneur who's fully committed and surrendered to the way of Jesus is well-credentialed people will have good ideas, but people who are connected to the Spirit will have God ideas.
Yeah, and to reflect even some language that you just used a moment ago, people who have the Spirit of God will have redemptive ideas.
Yeah.
Right? Not just profitable ideas, but redemptive. And maybe I'm seeing sort of like a Venn diagram where there's some overlap there.
Yeah. There's actually a fellow that used to attend the Scotts Valley Vineyard that he shared with me. I met him in one of these sort of entrepreneur conferences. He shared with me that he received the blueprint of a sort of a I don't know exactly what it is, but it's kind of like a medical device that can that basically helps people with like certain heart conditions. He literally received the blueprint for that device while he was in his car one day, just worshiping
I totally
God.
believe that.
And that there's something, again, everyone's mileage may vary, but there's something about those who are constantly connected to life with the Spirit and the revelation that the Lord might give us to solve a lot of the world's problems.
Well, just to reflect back to you, the parable you said a moment ago.
Yeah.
Some servants get 1 talent.
Yeah.
Some get 2 and some get 5, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the master's choice, right? So to use your phrase, the mileage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you're a 5
Right.
talent guy, or maybe you're 1. That's kind of immaterial in some sense.
Yeah.
It's what we do with it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, it's exactly, yeah. I mean, yeah, the way you said it. Totally.
Yeah, I really, really love that, because I'm just hoping that more people can hear this sort of thing and then feel permission to pursue some of these things. Because it was like I was telling you off mic before we kind of started this conversation.
Yeah.
I know that with a lot of circles, there's this sort of mindset that says, well, if you love God, you'll become a pastor. And if you really, really love God, you'll be a missionary,
Yeah.
or you'll be a church planter.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, let's do all of that.
Absolutely.
Right. But maybe some of the pastors, apostles, prophets, evangelists, and teachers are not full-time ministry in the church guys, but maybe they're economists, or maybe they're entrepreneurs, or maybe they're doing high-power things in urban settings, or maybe they're farmers. I mean, it could be any number of things, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would really love if people are hearing this conversation and are feeling the invitation and the permission of the Spirit to maybe like pursue the things that they're actually good at.
That's exactly, I mean, in doing ministry in a place like New York City, where, largely everyone comes to a place like this for their vocation. And so, obviously it's super competitive. And so people are going to have to devote a lot of time to their vocation. And, on the one hand, obviously you don't want to make your vocation your God. And there's obviously a temptation to do that in a place like New York. But at the same time, one of the things that we feel like, for lack of a better term, in terms of contextualization process and how to make disciples in a place like New York City, it's like, you know what? You are where you are for a reason. And the question is not, hey, how do I get out of this so I can do more stuff in the church? I mean, if you can do more stuff in the church, great.
That's right.
But really what we should be doing is figuring out how to empower people to be extraordinary attorneys, extraordinary consultants, extraordinary musicians, extraordinary Broadway actors, or extraordinary teachers, whatever field. There's a way to construct, your vocational identity, your mission, in accordance with how God created you, in accordance with biblical virtue and these biblical truths. And if we have an army of people out there in a city like New York doing stuff like that, I personally think that's probably a lot more effective. And I'm not saying by no means should we stop trying to gather as many people as we can on a Sunday, but
It's not either or.
yeah,
It's both and.
if we're not somehow empowering them to just sort of filter in and sort of, just sort of be the hands and feet of Jesus on a day-to-day basis in their daily vocations, in their daily neighborhoods. I don't know. I think that's basically what we focus a lot of what we do on.
That's amazing. My wife, she's an artist, and she started her own business. She owns a children's art studio.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It was really funny. She came home one day. We've been sort of serial entrepreneurs our whole life, even while we've been in ministry.
Yeah.
But she came home one day and she was like, "Hey, Adam, I rented a space and I'm starting an art studio." Just she hadn't talked to me at all. I'm like, "Really? Okay." Anyway, she started this thing and it's gone over really well. But to your point, in December at the elementary school in our city, the administration came to Heather and they said, "Hey, our art teacher just retired kind of suddenly and we're desperate. Could you come and be a long-term sub for us?" And Heather sort of wrestled with it, but she said, yeah, she'd like to do that. So she went in, and this whole semester she's been teaching that and then doing her method studio stuff in the afternoon. But because she's been the art teacher at the elementary school, she's been a teacher to 1,200 kids.
Wow.
Right? And it's really affected her, like emotionally, because she realizes, oh, these are 1,200 people, and maybe and maybe 500 or 600 of these little kids are from really difficult situations.
Right.
Like
right.
my county where I live in Kentucky is extremely poor.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's a great place, wonderful people, but she got to put her hands and her love and her heart
Mm-hmm.
into some kids who would never get to experience the things that she can teach them.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, just the kindness that my wife naturally carries, right? And
Yeah.
it's been a real eye-opener, I think, for her and for me about how much influence a teacher can have
Totally.
for the work of the kingdom, you know, to teach really well and to love and be affectionate to kids and to show just that warmth that
Yeah.
some kids are not getting at home.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't go anywhere now in town where Heather isn't mobbed by people and mobbed by kids.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But it's the same thing, you know? You use that phrase of like people scattered all over the city.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not just gathered on Sunday morning, but scattered for something bigger.
Yeah. And I mean, that's sort of the, I don't know, that's the in some sense, the picture of, you know, just the kind of community we want to create. And I know that's on the heart of all the, you know, our friends who are pastoring in the city is, you know, how do we, of course, we want, you know, great things to happen in our community groups, in our Sunday gatherings, in all our events that we put on. But, you know, really the proof of a disciple is, you know, what are you doing, you know, the other sort of 166 hours a week when you're not at church? And, you know, and I said that's, you know, a place like, you know, again, a place like New York, like that's sort of, I don't think we're going to you know, the competition, so to speak, for productions is just too high. You can't compete with Hamilton.
That's right.
You can't compete with whoever, all the great new restaurants that are showing up. Like, you know, the only way we're really going to, you know, do the things that, you know, we're called to do is if we're, you know, just showing up all the other times and, you know, trying to see what the Lord is doing and responding accordingly. So,
yeah. Well, let me just maybe hang a right turn here for a minute.
Sure.
And we've covered some of this, but I just want to maybe change the question for you here in the last little bit of our time together.
Mm-hmm.
The name of this podcast is The Ferment, and sort of our controlling narrative and metaphor is that people's spiritual lives are a lot like fermentation, that maybe something starts one way and ends up another way. And so I would just be real interested to hear you talk about maybe how you've changed or what's changed in your spiritual life. I mean, we've already heard one change from like really no faith to being a follower of Jesus, but you've been here. I know that you and your wife are kind of running a church here. Sort of a really experimental expression of the Vineyard here in the city.
Absolutely.
But what has changed? What's the new thing?
Well, honestly, like I would say one of the first changes, you know, that I experienced was you know, again, I came to faith as a mental assent to historical truth. I encountered the living God, you know, in my Ph.D. program. But in all seriousness, you know, it was really the like discovering the Vineyard, which really happened maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years into my walk with God. It was literally, I mean, you know, it was like literally opening up, you know, the going into the closet and, you know, opening up into Narnia. It was like this world of...
Yeah, you fell through the back of the wardrobe.
Yeah, I was just like, gosh, so there are these people, so you can actually be, you know, you could actually be biblically orthodox, and you could be fully engaged in life with the Holy Spirit, and you could actually be in a very natural way.
Normal.
Like you could
be a normal person.
You know, look, my colleagues are for the most part, you know, not, you know, they don't, they're not, you know, believers in Jesus, and but like, to be able to pray for them, and to, my business partner's son is on the spectrum of autism, for example. And so my wife and I have gone over and just prayed over him.
Yeah.
And it's always remarkable how much New Yorkers are willing to receive prayer. That's actually something that has been an interesting revelation. But I think that probably when I think about the term ferment, I would say that the influence that sort of the contemplative and Ignatian, sort of some of the Desert Father tradition has had.
Yeah.
And, really just, I was just sharing with someone recently, so much of my 20s and 30s is about, I want life to be, everything to be up and to the right. I want everything grow bigger. I want everything to, be getting stronger, and, growth. And of course, healthy things grow, and that's really, and obviously that's important. But I think that there's something about the value of the slow, the value of, and the truth is, so much of what, that I've learned from sort of the contemplative tradition is around, they're given my default personality is, how do I acquire a skill and then leverage that skill and, be fruitful and generate returns from that skill. There's all these traits that actually require just the time, and they can't be, they don't automatically produce overnight. And so the value of developing a rule of life, the value of organizing my life.
You're talking rule of life stuff. That's like an order.
Exactly.
An order of life.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of part of what.
But you're the guy who tends to write manifestos.
Yeah, but
so that inclination was there in the beginning.
Probably, but I think like being deliberate about everything in life, just like the value of practicing restraint in what we consume, the value of even like the restraint in how much technology we consume, what media we consume, and how that forms us over the long run. I think that's been one of the So when I hear the term ferment, I think about just sort of the slow process of how, and the habits that I want to sort of institutionalize in my life, so that process has the time to, to really take shape.
Yeah, so that's wonderful, and I can imagine that would be really helpful in a place like this, where really the whole city is built on the principle of up and to the right.
It absolutely, and I mean that's sort of the New York City is a very unlikely place to try to plant something that has order-like characteristics, right? These things belong in sort of away from the hubbub and the bustle of the city. But I think this is where there's an Ignatian component to the way I'm wired. Is we want to plant something like this that is just so looks so different from the way everyone else does business, but is actually in physical proximity to all the we're 2 blocks from Times Square, and then but invite
I think there's something poetic
in.
and beautiful about that.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I, we're believers in let's actually try to build and demonstrate the thing that we aspire to, and then invite folks in, like provide some measure of access. And so that there's a porousness required to life. And I think that's the way Jesus did things, is like he set these very, very high bars, but at the same time, there was access, there was accessibility to these things.
Yeah.
And so
I love that you guys are doing this. I love that you guys have done so well in your life, and then at the same time, you're building this church in the middle of the city. But you're still very connected to your job. You have a job, you know? It's not either other, it's both and I love that you're doing something that is contemplative, Ignatian. And while you were saying that, I was just thinking of even the way that Eugene Peterson or maybe Stanley Hauerwas occasionally talk about church as the alternative society.
Yeah.
Right? So there's this sense in which a lot of what we've talked about tonight has been like joining society. You know, it's that weird paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like we want to join the city, and then we want to be an alternative to the city.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a book, Alternative to Futility, that was written by Elton Trueblood. I think I have my facts straight, but I know that the title of the book is Alternative to Futility. And I think it was sort of a response to the alternative to was, I think, sort of Nazi Germany, essentially.
Yeah.
And the idea, though, was that we need to actually develop something that actually demonstrates a better way, not in a way that we're yelling at, you know, sort of the mainstream.
We're
society.
not diving into eugenics and hardcore materialism of the Third Reich, right?
Correct.
There's another better way.
Correct, and we can do that. And then, but ultimately invite people into that. And so, like, for example, we do morning prayer and worship here, you know, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. every weekday. And that's actually open to everyone. And it's just saying, you know what?
And people could come to that before they go to work.
Exactly. And the idea is, you know what? We want to start our day proclaiming that Jesus is the one true king. Because, you know, I mean, this isn't news to anyone. In a place like New York, there's a war going on for your affection. Basically, there's a war going on for, you know, who are you going to make God? And we just know that we're too weak to fight that battle without just in the morning declaring, you know what, Jesus is Lord. And
That's right.
It's a routine. And I by no means do I always feel like doing it. But there's something about saying, you know what, this is how we want to organize our lives, and other folks can come. And so we try to make the building, I mean, within certain reasonable limits, a porous place. We want to make our lives, in some sense, porous because, you know, of course, you know, we need good theologians, we need good writers, we need good, you know, we need people who offer things that can scale, but there's nothing scalable about inviting people into your home, into the actual structures where you reside, around a table.
Which is always the way.
Yeah, that feels like a lot of the way Jesus did what he did.
Man, if you read the Gospels, many of Jesus's best moments were around a table or with a meal.
Absolutely.
Like the dude is always eating.
There's something about that. I don't know. It took me a while to figure this stuff out, but, you know, just things around a table. There's something about what happens when you just put even pretty good food around a table.
That's right.
And you're able to just what that engenders.
Well, and that's what happened here last night.
That's exactly.
And just for everybody who's listening, like we had a meal here.
Mm-hmm.
It was so great. Like the meal was great. The wine was great. But the communion of the Spirit was actually what was really great.
It was a Kairos moment last night.
It really was.
Sure.
Yeah, and we've experienced that so many times, like even in our own home. Yeah, there's something about bringing people into your own space, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just so that people really get a picture of what's happening, like you're working in the city, but you guys have a building here. You live here. The prayer in the church is kind of on the bottom ground floor.
Correct.
You have morning prayer. You have afternoon prayer as well?
Yeah, prayer at lunchtime between 12 and 1.
So there's this coming and going in your regular life, and this connection to the city, but then also this sense in which your home has become a sanctuary.
And so it's a 8-story building. Again, just a couple blocks from Times Square, and myself and a couple of the families, we live here. But then there's all this other stuff going on, whether it's prayer.
It's been extremely inspirational in me, and I don't know even 10% of what you're doing, but the little bit I know is so inspirational, and it feels like a real modern approach to maybe what Jesus would want to do in urban settings.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's actually another family who, and look, we did this just to be totally honest because It's something I felt like I wanted to do. We never in any way, and these other families, we never in any sense felt like, I mean, we didn't expect anyone else to, try to do something like this. But just recently I found out a friend of mine who, and another family here in New York came by the building a couple times. They were like, gosh, we should try to do something like this. And there are people in other cities. And again, it doesn't have to exactly replicate this by any stretch, but I don't know. There's something about a space that is, the term I would use is, in some sense, we're trying to consecrate a place, and there's just, I don't know. There's something about the way God has organized the world such that those who are willing to do this, there's a way that impacts everybody who comes through it and around it.
Well, to sort of like maybe add a wine metaphor, another one here. My family and I, we raise grapes and we grow grapes and make wine. So I'm kind of a wine guy. It's one of my hobbies. But if you read wine writers, or if you get sort of deep into the culture a little bit, one of the things you'll oftentimes hear wine people talk about is they'll talk about wines of place. And the French even have a concept called terroir. And what they mean by it is like the wine is profoundly an expression of the place, the actual soil, the weather, what happened that year or what didn't happen. And of course, the winemaker can guide that. But the best winemaker is not wanting to put his fingerprint on the wine as much as he or she is wanting to let the place be what it is, right? And I kind of hear that, like a spirituality of place. A theology of place, an experience of place.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like the idea of how the winemaker is not trying. The raw materials are what they are. He's not trying to
you trust the materials.
Exactly. And in some sense, like that's why we call Coram Deo, which is Latin for in the presence of God, a house of prayer, worship, and entrepreneurship. And the idea is that worship, prayer and worship, I think there's an expression in the Vineyard. Worship is the act that allows everything else to be an act of worship. And so in some sense, like if we make prayer and worship the center of what we do, what comes out of that, we don't know exactly. Obviously, we have a yin for entrepreneurship, but like there are a lot of things that are just going to emerge. And as long as we trust that the substantive center of this is prayer and worship, surrender to God, we can trust that the organizations that come out of it, the churches that are planted out of it,
that's right,
will reflect that core, and it'll just have redemptive DNA like sewn into it.
That's right.
Sense. So,
well, 30 miles from where I live, 30 or 35 miles from where I live, there is a Trappist monastery.
Oh, is that the
Gethsemane?
Yeah,
it's where Merton did all of his writing.
Right. Actually, there's a book called The Business Secrets of the Trappist Monks that I think was written. Wait, this isn't the Memkin Abbey, is it?
No. This is the Abbey of Gethsemane. But there's many around.
Sure.
But 35 miles from my house, there's this place. The monks own 3,000 acres there.
Wow.
But what I love is that they've been doing prayer and worship for 160 years in this piece of ground. And they have seven hours of prayer. The first hour of prayer is at 3 a.m. And then they do their work in the day. And it's about three things in particular. It's about their worship to God and prayer. It's about their work of work and vocation on the land, and it's about hospitality.
Yeah.
And I see so much. I meant to tell you that last night, but I see so much of what they do there. Here, it's like you don't have the brown cloaks or something, and praise the Lord, you don't. But there's something about this space that feels very. It's modern monastic.
We that's. What you articulated is what we aspire to. So it's actually very encouraging that we at least have echoes.
Because I go there once a year for a silent retreat, and the spirit is similar here. There's an atmosphere of peace here.
Wow.
And I think you guys are doing it. I don't know anything. You may have fooled me, but I think you're doing it.
That's just really super encouraging. One of the things I shared with sort of a postulancy I'm a part of right now is, I'm in a season of life. I got to prune the good things for the sake of the ultimate thing. And that's sort of the, just hearing what you said about the Trappist at Gethsemane. It's like, look, we pray, we work, and then we practice hospitality.
That's it.
And, I probably have enough of some sort of broken spirit in me that wants to try to do too much. And to say no to good things is sometimes one of the most challenging things, because to say, what, but I'm actually getting better, and it's good to hear how that's sort of the ethos of a monastery like that.
That is, yeah, and I would assume this is a challenge for you because you seem like the kind of person who is pretty good at stuff. You're good, you're good at stuff. Yeah, no. You're being modest. You're good at stuff. I get that. Okay, 3 more quick questions,
sure,
and we'll wrap
sure.
here. Okay, number 1, what's your favorite soccer team?
The U.S. men's national team.
Man, heartbreakers.
Heartbreaking.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to know that you're long suffering.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay,
Absolutely.
good. Okay, question number 2. Less of a question. I guess it is a question. Could you just speak to the men and women who are listening to this who feel a call to business? What would you like to say to them? Maybe in just a minute or so.
Yeah, I would say it's a wonderful thing to be called into business, and to discover how we've been wired, to discover what God has sort of already put in us, and the additional things He wants to give to us through a life that's rooted in intimacy with Jesus, can find a profound, a beautiful, and fruitful expression in many spheres of the business world. And I would even argue that there's a real desire among the decision makers in a lot of businesses for people who have those kinds of attributes.
Amen.
I would say.
Amen.
They may not even know it, but if you show up with it, it will be highly valued. And I'm not saying that marketplace validation is the end point, but I'm just saying we live in a time where to be grounded in intimacy with Jesus and to be fully aware of who we are and what we're called to do, and to do so under His authority, will find a resounding reception in large swaths of the business world.
Oh man, I'm going to take that as a prophetic word. I feel that. That's good. Okay, last question, and we finish the podcast like this every single week.
Okay.
Could you just tell us the time when you experienced great joy?
We're going to go back to question number 1, the U.S. men's national team.
Okay, yeah, okay, good.
In 2010, in the World Cup, the U.S. was moments away from being eliminated, but then Landon Donovan scored a goal in the 90-something. It was in injury time that put us through to the round of 16. And I will shamelessly and boldly admit that sometimes when I feel sad, I go back to YouTube. Somebody put a YouTube clip together of the goal and the reactions of bars and living rooms all around the world to that
were you?
Goal. So I mean, I was here. I was watching it in my home.
Did you lose your mind?
I just went bonkers. I mean, that was. I have this strange, potentially disorderly attachment, I will admit, to...
You're talking to a Kentucky basketball fan.
Yeah,
we know
exactly.
all about strange and disorderly attachments, okay?
But that was, that and, I have to say there's a couple more that come from sports. When the New York Giants beat the New England Patriots in the 2008 Super Bowl, after the Patriots had gone 16-0, we had 100 people in our loft watching all that together.
Fairly sweet.
It was
fairly sweet.
Amazing.
Amen. Those are great moments. Well, John, thank you for doing this.
This was a lot of fun.
I think you shared some great stuff here.
This was
it's
a lot of fun.
It's going to bless people. All right, everybody. Hey, I think you have some things to think about, some things to maybe pray about. Dig in. Peace.
Hey, everybody, this is Casey Coram, the producer of the Ferment podcast. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I've got a couple ways you could really help us. First of all, review the podcast on iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Also, connect with us on social media, on Instagram at the Ferment Podcast and on Twitter at FermentCast. All right, people, see you next time.